Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are completing The Will to Power. We are up to Book 4, Section 6, entitled The Highest Man as Lawgiver of the Future. And for those following along, we are up to Aphorism 972. And with that said, I'll go ahead and get started. The Lawgivers of the Future. After having tried for a long time in vain to attach a particular meaning to the word philosopher, for I found many antagonistic traits, I recognize that we can distinguish between two kinds of philosophers. One, those who desire to establish any large system of values, logical or moral. Two, those who are the lawgivers of such valuations. The former tried to seize upon the world of the present or the past by embodying or abbreviating the multifarious phenomena by means of signs. Their object is to make it possible for us to survey, to reflect upon, to comprehend, and to utilize everything that has happened hitherto. They serve the purpose of man by using all past things to the benefit of his future. The second class, however, are commanders. They say, "Thus shall it be." They alone determine the whither and the wherefore, and that which will be useful and beneficial to man. They have command over the previous work of scientific men, and all knowledge is to them only a means to their creations. This second kind of philosopher seldom appears, and as a matter of fact, their situation and their danger is appalling. How often have they not intentionally blindfolded their eyes in order to shut out the sight of the small strip of ground which separates them from the abyss and from utter destruction? Plato, for instance, when he persuaded himself that the good, as he wanted it, was not Plato's good, but the good in itself, the eternal treasure which a certain man of the name of Plato had chanced to find on his way. This same will to blindness prevails in a much coarser form in the case of the founders of religion. Their "thou shalt" must on no account sound to the ears like "I will." They only dare to pursue their task as if under the command of God. Their legislation of values can only be a burden. They can only bear if they regard it as revelation. In this way their conscience is not crushed by the responsibility. As soon as those two comforting expedients, that of Plato and that of Muhammad, have been overthrown, and no thinker can any longer relieve his conscience with the hypothesis God or eternal values, the claim of the lawgiver to determine new values rises to an awfulness which has not yet been experienced. Now those elect, on whom the faint light of such a duty is beginning to dawn, try and see whether they cannot escape it, as their greatest danger, by means of a timely side spring. For instance, they try to persuade themselves that their task is already accomplished, or that it defies accomplishment, or that their shoulders are not broad enough for such burdens, or that they are already taken up with burdens closer to hand, or even that this new and remote duty is a temptation and a seduction, drawing them away from all other duties. A disease, a kind of madness. Many, as a matter of fact, do succeed in evading the path appointed to them. Throughout the whole of history, we can see the traces of such deserters and their guilty consciences. In most cases, however, there comes to such men of destiny that hour of delivery, that autumnal season of maturity in which they are forced to do that which they did not even wish to do. And that deed before which in the past they have trembled most falls easily and unsought from the tree as an involuntary deed, almost as a present. 973. The Human Horizon. Philosophers may be conceived as men who make the greatest efforts to discover to what extent man can elevate himself. This holds good more particularly of Plato, how far man's power can extend. That they do this as individuals. Perhaps the instinct of Caesars and of all founders of states, etc., was greater, for it preoccupied itself with the question how far man could be urged forward in development under favorable circumstances. What they did not sufficiently understand, however, was the nature of favorable circumstances. The great question, where has the plant man grown most magnificently heretofore? In order to answer this, a comparative study of history is necessary. 974. Every fact and every work exercises a fresh persuasion over every age and every new species of man. History always enunciates new truths. 975. To remain objective, severe, firm, and hard while making a thought prevail is perhaps the best forte of artists. But if for this purpose anyone have to work upon human material, as teachers, statesmen have to do, etc., then the repose, the coldness, and the hardness soon vanish. In natures like Caesar and Napoleon, we are able to divine something of the nature of disinterestedness in their work on their marble, whatever be the number of men that are sacrificed in the process. In this direction, the future of higher men lies, to bear the greatest responsibilities and not to go to rack and ruin through them. Hitherto, the deceptions of inspiration have almost always been necessary for a man not to lose faith in his own hand and in his right to his task. 976. The reason why philosophers are mostly failures, because among the conditions which determine them there are qualities which generally ruin other men. 1. A philosopher must have an enormous multiplicity of qualities. He must be a sort of abbreviation of man, and have all men's high and base desires. The danger of the contrast within him, and of the possibility of his loathing himself. 2. He must be inquisitive in an extraordinary number of ways. The danger of versatility. 3. He must be just and honest in the highest sense, but profound both in love and hate, and in injustice. 4. He must not only be a spectator, but a lawgiver, a judge and defendant, in so far as he is an abbreviation of the world. 5. He must be extremely multiform, and yet firm and hard. He must be supple. 977. The really regal calling of the philosopher, according to the expression of Alcuin the Anglo-Saxon, quote, to correct what is wrong, and strengthen the right, and raise what is holy. 978. The new philosopher can only arise in conjunction with a ruling class as the highest spiritualization of the latter. Great politics, the rule of the earth as a proximate contingency, the total lack of principles necessary thereto. 979. Fundamental concept. The new values must first be created. This remains our duty. The philosopher must be our lawgiver. New species. How the greatest species hitherto, for instance, the Greeks, were reared. This kind of accident must now be consciously striven for. 980. Supposing one thinks of the philosopher as an educator who, looking down from his lonely elevation, is powerful enough to draw long chains of generations up to him, then he must be granted the most terrible privileges of a great educator. An educator never says what he himself thinks, but only that which he thinks it is good for those whom he is educating to hear upon any subject. This dissimulation on his part must not be found out. It is part of his masterliness that people should believe in his honesty. He must be capable of all the means of discipline and education. There are some natures which he will only be able to raise by means of lashing them with his scorn. Others who are lazy, irresolute, cowardly, and vain, he will be able to affect only with exaggerated praise. Such a teacher stands beyond good and evil, but nobody must know that he does. 981. We must not make men better. We must not talk to them about morality in any form as if morality in itself, or an ideal kind of man in general, could be taken for granted. But we must create circumstances in which stronger men are necessary, such as for their part will require a morality, or better still, a bodily and spiritual discipline, which makes men strong, and upon which they will consequently insist. As they will need one so badly, they will have it. We must not let ourselves be seduced by blue eyes and heaving breasts. Greatness of soul has absolutely nothing romantic about it, and unfortunately nothing whatever amiable either. 982. From warriors we must learn, 1. To associate death with those interests for which we are fighting. That makes us venerable. 2. We must learn to sacrifice numbers, and to take our cause sufficiently seriously not to spare men. 3. We must practice inexorable discipline, and allow ourselves violence and cunning in war. 983. The education which rears those ruling virtues that allow a man to become master of his benevolence and his pity, the great disciplinary virtues, forgive thine enemies, is mere child's play beside them, and the passions of the Creator must be elevated to the heights. We must cease from carving marble. The exceptional and powerful position of those creatures, compared with that of all princes hitherto, the Roman Caesar with Christ's soul. 984. We must not separate greatness of soul from intellectual greatness. For the former involves independence, but without intellectual greatness, independence should not be allowed. All it does is to create disasters, even in its lust of well-doing and of practicing justice. Inferior spirits must obey. Consequently, they cannot be possessed of greatness. 985. The more lofty philosophical man who is surrounded by loneliness, not because he wishes to be alone, but because he is what he is and cannot find his equal, what a number of dangers and torments are reserved for him, precisely at the present time, when we have lost our belief in the order of rank, and consequently no longer know how to understand or honor this isolation. Formerly the sage almost sanctified himself in the consciences of the mob by going aside in this way. Today the anchorite sees himself as though enveloped in a cloud of gloomy doubt and suspicions. And not alone by the envious and the wretched. In every well-meaning act that he experiences, he is bound to discover misunderstanding, neglect, and superficiality. He knows the crafty tricks of foolish pity, which makes these people feel so good and holy when they attempt to save him from his own destiny by giving him more comfortable situations and more decent and reliable society. Yes, he will even get to admire the unconscious lust of destruction with which all mediocre spirits stand up and oppose him, believing all the while that they have a holy right to do so. For men of such incomprehensible loneliness, it is necessary to put a good stretch of country between them and the officiousness of their fellows. This is part of their prudence. For such a man to maintain himself uppermost today, amid the dangerous maelstroms of the age which threaten to draw him under, even cunning and disguise will be necessary. Every attempt he makes to order his life in the present and with the present, every time he draws near to these men and their modern desires, he will have to expiate as if it were an actual sin, and withal he may look with wonder at the concealed wisdom of his nature, which after every one of these attempts immediately leads him back to himself by means of illness and painful accidents. 986. Cursed whoever saddens an immortal spirit. Manzoni. 987. The most difficult and the highest form which man can attain is the most seldom successful. Thus the history of philosophy reveals a superabundance of bungled and unhappy cases of manhood, and its march is an extremely slow one. Whole centuries intervene and suppress what has been achieved, and in this way the connecting link is always made to fail. It is an appalling history, this history of the highest men, of the sages. What is most often damaged is precisely the recollection of great men, for the semi-successful and botched cases of mankind misunderstand them and overcome them by their quote-unquote successes. Whenever an effect is noticeable, the masses gather in a crowd round it. To hear the inferior and the poor in spirit having their say is a terrible ear-splitting torment for him who knows and trembles at the thought that the fate of man depends upon the success of its highest types. From the days of my childhood I have reflected upon the sage's conditions of existence, and I will not conceal my happy conviction that in Europe he has once more become possible, perhaps only for a short time. 988. These new philosophers begin with a description of a systematic order of rank and difference of value among men. What they desire is, alas, precisely the reverse of an assimilation and equalization of man. They teach estrangement in every sense. They cleave gulfs such as never yet existed, and they would fain have man become more evil than he ever was. For the present they live concealed and estranged even from each other. For many reasons they will find it necessary to be anchorites and to wear masks. They will therefore be of little use in the matter of seeking for their equals. They will live alone and probably know the torments of all the loneliest forms of loneliness. Should they, however, thanks to any accident, meet each other on the road, I wager that they would not know each other, or that they would deceive each other in a number of ways. 989. Philosophers are not made to love one another. Eagles do not fly in company. One must leave that to partridges and starlings. Soaring on high and having talons, that is the lot of great geniuses. Galliani. 990. I forgot to say that such philosophers are cheerful, and that they like to sit in the abyss of a perfectly clear sky. They are in need of different means for enduring life than other men, for they suffer in a different way. That is to say, just as much from the depth of their contempt of man as from their love of man. The animal which suffered most on earth discovered for itself laughter. 991. Concerning the misunderstanding of cheerfulness. It is a temporary relief from long tension. It is the wantonness, the saturnalia of a spirit which is consecrating and preparing itself for long and terrible resolutions. The fool in the form of science. 992. The new order of rank among spirits. Tragic natures no longer in the van. 993. It is a comfort to me to know that over the smoke and filth of human baseness there is a higher and brighter mankind, which, judging from their number, must be a small race, for everything that is in the way distinguished is ipso facto rare. A man does not belong to this race because he happens to be more gifted, more virtuous, more heroic, or more loving than the men below, but because he is colder, brighter, more far-sighted, and more lonely. Because he endures, prefers, and even insists upon loneliness as the joy, the privilege, yea, even the condition of existence. Because he lives amid clouds and lightnings as among his equals, and likewise among sunrays, dewdrops, snowflakes, and all that which must needs come from the heights, and which in its course moves ever from heaven to earth. The desire to look aloft is not our desire. Heroes, martyrs, geniuses, and enthusiasts of all kinds are not quiet, patient, subtle, cold, or slow enough for us. 994. The absolute conviction that valuations above and below are different, that innumerable experiences are wanting to the latter, that when looking upwards from below, misunderstandings are necessary. 995. How do men attain to great power and to great tasks? All the virtues and proficiencies of the body and the soul are little by little laboriously acquired, through great industry, self-control, and keeping oneself within narrow bounds, through a frequent, energetic, and genuine repetition of the same work and of the same hardships. But there are men who are the heirs and masters of this slowly acquired and manifold treasures of virtues and proficiencies, because, owing to happy and reasonable marriages, and also to lucky accidents, the acquired and accumulated forces of many generations, instead of being squandered and subdivided, have been assembled together by means of steadfast struggling and willing. And thus in the end a man appears who is such a monster of strength that he craves for a monstrous task. For it is our power which has commanded of us, and the wretched intellectual play of aims and intentions and motivations lies only in the foreground, however much weak eyes may recognize the principal factors in these things. 990. The sublime man has the highest value, even when he is the most delicate and fragile, because an abundance of very difficult and rare things have been reared through many generations and united in him. 997. I teach that there are higher and lower men, and that a single individual may, under certain circumstances, justify whole millenniums of existence. That is to say, a wealthier, more gifted, greater, and more complete man as compared with innumerable imperfect and fragmentary men. 998. Away from rulers and rid of all bonds live the highest men, and in the rulers they have their instruments. 999. The order of rank. He who determines values and leads the will of millenniums, and does this by leading the highest natures, he is the highest man. 1000. I fancy I have divined some of the things that lie hidden in the soul of the highest man. Perhaps every man who has divined so much must go to ruin, but he who has seen the highest man must do all he can to make him possible. Fundamental thought. We must make the future the standard of all our valuations, and not seek the laws for our conduct behind us. 1001. Not quote-unquote mankind, but Superman is the goal. 1002. Quote, how man makes himself eternal. End quote. Dante, Inferno. This is the end of part 13 of books 3 and 4 of The Will to Power. Thank you for listening.